Hello and welcome to this video. On this video I'm going to be going through the 10 greatest jazz albums of all time if we use the criteria of going from decade to decade, picking what we think is the best album from that decade and then adding them all up. And with the history of jazz, if we start in 1920 and then go up to 2020, we luckily get 10 decades. And so we get an album from every one of those decades. Now, I've done this video before, but of course, when you just look at it sort of as a big picture, what you get is a list which basically looks at a lot of the great albums from the classic period jazz, the albums that were very influential. And so it's highly unlikely that anything after 1980 or 1990 is going to crop up on the list. What's interesting about doing this is we get a much more sort of democratic time-based list. You know, there's a lot, they're different albums. And actually, I think if you wanted 10 albums to represent the sort of history of jazz that goes all the way through right up until today, this list is very, very interesting. Of course, some of my biases are in here, but I will try and explain that as we go. Now, I've done another video where I've gone through the 10 most important albums overall in all of history. And the first 3 were jazz albums. So I don't want to repeat myself too much. So when we kick off with 1920, I'm going to go a lot faster through these first 3 albums. And then when we get to 1950, it's different and I will slow down at that point. So shall we kick off? So I think the greatest jazz album from the 1920s, without a doubt, and I can't think of anything that, this is like pretty much, most people would say this, would be the collection of Hot 5s and Hot 7 recordings by Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong was born in New Orleans in 1901. He grew up in pretty poverty-stricken situation in a very racist environment. When he was 11 or 12, he got arrested for shooting a blank pistol off, and he got stuck in a wife's home where he was given a cornet. And from that point on, his genius emerged, and he soon became the most important soloist in New Orleans, eventually taking him up with him joining the King Oliver Band and going up to Chicago, where this revolution was happening in an industrial sort of northern town. So a lot of jazz musicians and blues musicians were going up to Chicago by the 1920s. And this coincided with jazz being recorded. So at some point, Louis Armstrong goes into a recording studio to make what is seen at that time as a novelty records, the same as most jazz music was. But the difference with Louis Armstrong is the guy was a genius, and his genius becomes apparent at this point. And his genius is in the fact that he had developed his own individual voice, not only as a trumpet player, but also as a singer. That his trumpet playing was virtuoso and inspired. It wasn't just the average sort of group improvisation type solo that you had from New Orleans. He understood the recording process. He understood that he needed to arrange the music, one, to actually favor individual soloists because it would make the structure of the record better. He actually invents the solo in jazz. But also he can tell stories. He uses voiceover, sound effects, all sorts of different things. And his genius is to basically understand how the recording process is going to relate to popular music, but also experimental and avant-garde music all together. And he does this with a group that was put specially together to work in the recording studio. This is another one of his breakthroughs. This wasn't his touring band or gigging band. The Hot 5s and the Hot 7s were specifically put together to make recordings. His genius shines through, and we can have that as a starting point for all aspects of 20th century non-classical, non-orchestral music. The whole lot, it touches everything. So that's what I've got for 1920, is the Hot 5s and Hot 7s recording, which were recorded somewhere between 1925 to 1926 and probably 1929, something like that. The virtuosity that Louis Armstrong brings into popular music right at the start means that music starts to develop at an incredible level. And before you know it, the innovations of Louis Armstrong have been codified into the big bands and swing bands of the 1930s. And these albums start to make, these recordings start to sell in their millions, creating what we know as a popular music of the 20th century. You add some vocalists in there, you know, whether it's Frank Sinatra or Bing Crosby, and before you know it, you have popular music. But I would like to put forward for the 1930s the album by Art Tatum, which is called Piano Starts Here. Art Tatum is probably the greatest musical virtuoso over the 20th century. He embodies everything, you know, classical technique, incredible tone, incredible chops, and also an awareness of all the jazz styles up until the 1930s. And then he goes beyond, creating a harmonic and improvisational framework, which is going to set up for bebop. And anybody now that decides to sort of showcase their chops, which is the biggest thing on Instagram and YouTube amongst musicians, is basically going back to Art Tatum. His album Piano Starts Here, which came out in, I think, the late 60s, but was recorded in 1933, is basically him sat before a piano playing things that no one had ever heard before. Right, classical musician couldn't have done this because it's coming from Art Tatum's mind. He's taking popular songs like Tea for Two, and he's just deconstructing them and creating high art out of them. It's an essential album for anybody who wants to understand 20th century music and understand what virtuosity is within that, which is a very hot topic throughout the 20th century as popular music forms go towards virtuosity and then suddenly rail against it, for it and against it. The innovations of Art Tatum then can be seen in the next generation of jazz musicians that emerged in the 1940s, playing bebop, which attempts to turn jazz into a serious music form, but also an anti-establishment music form, based upon the new aspect of racial pride and that is emerging in America. These musicians want to not only celebrate their genius, but also separate them, not so much against a racial divide, but a generational divide. In this respect, bebop could see the punk moment for jazz, but it's also where we get this idea of the jazz snobbery and the idea that you have to be able to play the changes. And this comes from one musician, it's Charlie Parker, who's an absolute genius. If you imagine taking the instrumental future thinking of Louis Armstrong, the virtuosity of Art Tatum, transferred it onto the saxophone, but that by the end of the 1930s has become the preeminent instrument in jazz, taking over from the cornet and the trumpet. And then you put it in the hands of Charlie Parker, that just seems to exude a new way of phrasing, a new sound. And Parker is just after Louis Armstrong, is the next sound innovator. He's the one that's got the key to the sound of jazz, and he changes the sound of jazz. Now, what's interesting in the 1940s is that there was a recording ban. So there's no records really charting the development of bebop. We have the Mintons recording from the late 30s with Charlie Christian, Thelonious Monk, Kenny Clark, no Charlie Parker. And we can see the beginnings of that. And there's a few recordings here and there amongst the popular music, but there's no bebop recordings until 1945 when that record ban is lifted. So we have a very unique thing happen on November the 26th, 1945, because Charlie Parker walks into the studio with bebop fully formed. No one's ever heard it before. He's got a group, sometimes with Dizzy Gillespie on trumpet, sometimes with Miles Davis. And they record on that one day the defining records of bebop, things like Billy's Bounce, Coco, Now's the Time. That one day in that one studio created more masterpieces than in any other time in history. Any album, and I think this was recorded for the Candid record label, any album that collects those recordings together is an essential jazz album. But I'm going to put forward as the album the recordings made by Charlie Parker on November the 26th, 1945. Right, so I have zipped. That's me going slow, everybody. So I'm going fast, but it was slow, really, wasn't it? So we're up to 1950s now. Now, if you go and check out my greatest albums thing, you can see I've just covered those first three albums identical, but this is where we now see a split. Now, why do we see a split here? For the greatest albums of all time, I put Elvis Presley's debut album. And Elvis Presley's debut album is nowhere near as sophisticated as the album I've got for jazz here, because jazz has split off. All that rock and roll, all that rhythm and blues, all that soul, Ray Charles, all that stuff that's going to happen in the 1950s, all that's going to move towards then the Stones and the Beatles and Led Zeppelin. It's actually a wing of jazz, and bebop cuts it off. You know, the rhythm and blues, you know, and the jump bands in the 1940s, they go off in another tangent. They team up with country music, you know, and you get rock and roll, which then teams up with the blues, and you get rock music. You also get rhythm and blues, you know, teaming up with gospel music through Ray Charles. You know, I Got a Woman, and before you know it, you got soul and R&B and funk, and then they all cross over. And that's the direction. We're going off in that direction. Jazz is now elitist. Jazz has now elevated itself. But it's still countercultural. Most people who are working in it are heroin addicts. You know, they're living at in a nether world, right? This is still going on, but there is an attempt in the 1950s to make jazz very serious. Musicians like the Modern Jazz Quartet, Dave Brubeck, they almost want to turn this into like a chamber art form. Other musicians want to take the sort of grease and funkiness of rhythm and blues, but combine it with the sort of improvisational and structural approaches of bebop, and you get hard bop. There's one guy in the 1950s that seems to bring all this together and add other things in, and that's Charlie Mingus. And I think the album from 1959, is a brilliant example of the best of jazz in the 1950s all the way through. It's got elements of cool jazz, it's got elements of West Coast jazz, it's got elements of third stream jazz. Charlie Mingus is a bebop bass player, played with Charlie Parker, but he is a big fan of Duke Ellington, and he brings that sort of arrangement and orchestral approach, but he's also interested in the group improvisation that comes from New Orleans. So you get this sort of beginnings of free jazz in there as well. Now, 1959 is probably the watershed year for jazz, in the same way that for prog and all the stuff, music we like, it's 1972 or 73. 59 is that year for jazz. It produced 4 absolutely landmark albums. Kind of Blue, which goes on to become the biggest jazz album in history and introduce the idea of modality into jazz. You get Shape of Jazz to Come by Ornette Coleman, which is another way of expanding jazz. We get Dave Brubeck's Time's Out, which looks at the rhythm and time signatures, another way of expanding on jazz. But I think the greatest of these 4 albums is Mingus Art. I think the breadth that Mingus takes on, because basically, although it's so forward-looking and we really see the elements of free jazz emerging on this album, it's basically looking back at jazz history in a way the other albums I've mentioned aren't, you know, especially with Ornette Coleman, which is really like, this is over now. We're going here. Mingus Art this is something I find fascinating. The reason it's called Art is because it's referring to Latin declensions. So imagine Mingus was a doing word. So you know, so I watch you, watch she, watches he, she watch. So what you get is Mingus, Ming which means Mingus for me, Mingus for you, and Mingus for all of us. So what he's doing is he's trying to create music that everybody can grasp at, and he's doing this by going back and creating tributes to all the jazz that has existed before. So we get the very famous we get like Goodbye Pork Pie Hat, which is a tribute to Lester Young, one of the great soloists. We get Boogie Stuff Shuffle, which is like a jump up, you know, rhythm and blues track, you know, and it's a blues and it rocks, and is basically the forerunner of like the Batman theme. Every one of these is looking backwards, but within it is also the key to the future. It's a key album. And I actually think Mingus Arum, you know, and I'm not a huge Mingus fan. I've never listened to a lot of him. But for me, this album in 1959 is a watershed album. Jazz up until that point has been a thing, and it's now going to be another thing. It's now going to split. It's now going to become very esoteric. It's going to lose its commercial appeal, and it's going to come up against rock music. That's what's going to happen. For the 1960s, I have, well, what are the contenders for the 1960s? The incredible Bill Evans albums, Live at the Village Vanguard, you know, incredible album. The Miles Davis Quintet album, maybe Miles Smalls, Nefertiti, that could be in there. What else? Because some of the free jazz albums by Archie Shepp, Albert Ayler, you've got like Ornette Coleman's later albums, the early free jazz albums, perhaps free jazz, although that's quite unlistenable for most people. What else have we got in the 60s that is very, very important in jazz? Ornette Coleman, mentioned him. Miles, mentioned him. I'm not mentioning John Coltrane. You all shouted at me, like, what about John Coltrane? What about John Coltrane? Yeah. For me, 60s jazz, the peak is John Coltrane. And the journey he goes from 1957 to 1967 when he dies is from sort of a post-bebop, taking bebop, moving into 3 dimensions, exploring the blues, exploring modality. And by the time he dies, he has taken jazz, to a... He's made the music something that we use to reach up spiritually. Coltrane seems to me, because he's one of the most important musicians in my life, John Coltrane is, he seems to embody 2 things: the quest for peace and solace through a music that is quite close to Indian classical music. It's a contemplative music, but a music that also embodies the angst and terror of the situation, an existentialist terror. And he tries to bring those 2 things together. So he creates a spiritual music for Western industrial culture, which is going through the shift that is happening in the 1960s. It points at the civil rights movement, it points at rock music, it points at drug culture, it points at the embrace of Eastern religions. It's such an incredible achievement. My favourite Coltrane album from the 1960s is Live at Birdland, because I think it's got the breadth of everything he does, but without doubt the masterpiece, the album that's crossed over, that sold millions of copies, even though it's pretty out there, is A Love Supreme. And that's the album I've got here for the 1960s. And A Love Supreme then provides really provides the blueprint for the jazz fusion musicians of how they are going to improvise. And when I say jazz fusion musicians, it's also people like Hendrix, also people like the Byrds, Jefferson Airplane, the Grateful Dead. They're freed up. It democratizes. Even though Coltrane's so sophisticated, it democratizes, because Coltrane goes back to the blues, and it shows how you can use the blues to create sort of interstellar improvisation. It's very interesting. And you see so many guitarists in the late 60s with their distortion, which is trying to emulate Coltrane's sound, I believe, feeling that they are exploring the outer limits. The Doors. The Doors, they're listening to Coltrane. You have A Love Supreme in 64, and then 65, 66, you've got the Doors, and you've got The End. And the other thing is, all the albums that I mentioned, all the other ones, they don't occupy the cultural space that Coltrane does. I find it very surprising. Coltrane made money, he sold albums. I mean, he made a lot of albums to make a lot of money, but I'm going to go off on an hour on Coltrane if I'm not careful. So shall we just move on to the 1970s, right? For me, all the great important albums of the 1970s in terms of jazz and jazz fusion albums. Any album I pick that doesn't consider what's happened in the jazz fusion world would be wrong, but I don't want to pick a straight ahead jazz album either. I am going to go for the 1970s with Belonging by Keith Jarrett and Jan Garbarek, recorded on ECM Records. I think in terms of jazz, if we want to differentiate jazz from jazz rock, although ECM did a ton of stuff with jazz rock, ECM's version of jazz rock is much closer to the spirit of jazz. And Belonging, although it's got elements on there that are definitely coming out of jazz rock, and you could categorize it as a jazz rock, it's still an acoustic quartet. It's got elements of bebop in there. There's even stronger elements from Ornette Coleman and free jazz. You've got Americana and gospel influences there as well. And it's just sounds incredible. Keith Jarrett is a sublime musician, a level of virtuosity and musicality which is really unsurpassable and can become a bit much, but with Belonging, it's wound in. Belonging just nails it. I could have gone for Expectations with the American band, but again, that's much closer to jazz rock fusion. This, on the whole, I would regard as a jazz album. I have no interest here in championing albums by Dexter Gordon or Sonny Rollins or any of these albums which the mainstream jazz think were holding the torch of jazz against all these Herbie Hancock funk albums that was going on, which then manifests itself in the 1980s with the sort of whole, Young Lions, let's go back to the hard bopping delights of the early 60s that we have with Wynton Marsalis. And I am going to get into the Marsalises here. I've got an album, but not yet. The jazz fusion in the 80s is on the whole rubbish. It's been taken over by popular music. The great things that jazz fusion has originated have been assimilated by the culture. And basically what jazz fusion gives the mainstream culture is the development of a certain way of playing rhythm and blues, funk and soul, which then gets taken on by the likes of Prince and Michael Jackson. So all the American pop music, has got not only the inspiration from jazz rock fusion, but it's actually using a lot of musicians from that world as well. Jazz fusion musicians are all over Michael Jackson albums, and Quincy Jones is the great jazz arranger. But even if we look at Like a Virgin by Madonna, we've got Reggie Lucas from Miles Davis's band producing that. They're all having hit records. In the same way as progressive rock informs the popular music of the UK, jazz rock fusion informs the music in the US, and the initial, fire of the Mavish Orchestra has been long forgotten by this point. The reaction to this is for jazz musicians to return to jazz. And as Jason Marsalis pointed out to me, who is the brother of Wynton Marsalis, it wasn't Wynton that did this. People like Chick Corea and Herbie Hancock and even John McLaughlin were returning to a much more acoustic jazz-based approach in the 1980s. The fusion is rubbish because it can't compete with the popular music that it begat. And I don't want to stick... I nearly put Black Codes on by Wynton Marsalis because that really represents this sort of retro conservative approach to jazz, but at a high level, because Black Codes is incredible, absolutely incredible. But I'm not, because I feel that actually what's most important in jazz in the 1980s is the assimilation of a whole bunch of things that happened before. Free jazz, avant-garde jazz, and that's where it's cutting edge. Now, we get the emergence of M-Bass, and I would have liked to put one of the early Steve Coleman albums on, but I haven't. I'm going to go with Ornette Coleman. I believe that if you really want to understand Ornette Coleman's genius, look at the albums in the 1980s. I know everybody wants to go back because they sound so classy and tasteful and go back to those old Don Cherry albums. But listen to the primetime albums. What Ornette's done is he's taken his free jazz harmonic approach, but he's mixed it with funk, rock music, the Mahavishnu Orchestra, dance music, all sorts of different things. And the albums that come on out after Of Human Feelings, Virgin Beauty, there are a whole host of these incredible albums that are coming up. Tone Dialing, his soundtrack to the William Burroughs film Naked Lunch. This is, if you really want to see what a genius this guy was, go and listen to that. And of course, the mainstream guys like Schofield and Pat Metheny that are now ruling the 1980s in terms of jazz rock and jazz rock fusion, they are product. They're not post Coltrane musicians. They're post Ornette musicians. So what album personifies all this, from the the Fuzak commerciality of those musicians to the sort of world dominating Pat Metheny with his sort of post ECM thing, the avant-garde of the prime time and the harmonic bands, and it is personified, which is by perhaps one of the most challenging, but I believe the greatest jazz album of the 1980s, which is Song X, which was created in 1986 by Pat Metheny and Ornette Coleman, and also features Charlie Hayden from the old classic quartet on double bass, Jack DeJohnette, which is almost like the Elvin Jones, Miles Davis thing, on drums, and then Donardo Coleman playing Simmons drums, adding a very contemporary sound. This album is not for the faint-hearted, but it's a work of absolute genius. In 1986, 2 albums came out for me, Song X and Public Image Limited album, and those are the 2 greatest albums of the 1980s as far as I'm concerned. And they encompass punk, rock, metal, jazz, avant-garde jazz, fusion, Indian music, classical music. It's everything on those 2 albums is there. And everything in the 1980s sounds terrible now, except for these 2 albums. So that's what I've got for the 1980s is Song X. Right, so by the time we get to the 1990s, there's a lot of incredible music going on, and what's happened is there's been a renaissance. It's like popular music is having its second progressive rock period, and this has come out of dance music. Dance music has got incredibly sophisticated, and suddenly we've got the likes of Square Pusher, Aphex Twin, or Tekra, Photech on the electronica side. We've got on the hip hop side groups like Brand Nubian, Michelle Ndegeocello, and then people like Guru and Jazz Mataz bringing in jazz musicians. We get the incredible Stolen Moments album, which is created by the Red Hot and Cool charity that brings all these jazz musicians together. We've also got like jungle and drum and bass. That's informing, you've got big beat. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on. It's all crossing over. Radiohead on Kid A bring out a full-on jazz track on there that they work with Humphrey Lyttelton from the traditional jazz world of the UK. It's all over the place, right? And I find that what we've got here is the coming together of what the Young Lions had done, which was really important in the 1980s. And it starts to relax itself. And the musician I find most compelling of all those is Branford Marsalis. Branford in the late 80s does his Bookshop Le Funk hip-hop rap fusion thing. But he brings out a jazz album, because we really need to have a jazz album here. I could go on and bring out, I could go and find a million sort of fusion-y albums that would be very interesting. But this is a jazz. Well, I need a jazz album, which is not backwards looking, but is a pure jazz album that's also embraces hip-hop and popular music forms and fusion, but in a way where it still remains being jazz, a little bit like Belonging in the 1970s. And I'm going to go with The Dark Keys by Branford Marsalis from 1996. This album is absolutely incredible. This is a piano-less trio. So it's Branford, obviously, on tenor sax. He might be on soprano sax, can't remember. You've got the great Jeff Tame Watts, one of the greatest drummers of the last 40 years on drums, and the incredible Reginald Veal on bass. This is a powerhouse of a band. This is like the Jimi Hendrix experience, but in jazz terms. No piano. So, however Branford Marsalis wants to go back to the tradition of jazz, there's that great big space in the music. He brings guests in. He's got Joe Lovano and Kenny Garrett, the other two great saxophone players of this period. This album is just incredible. It's fiery. It's out there. It's got elements of free jazz in, hard bop. It just is a summation of everything that is great about jazz in 1996. And there's elements of popular music. There's elements of fusion in there. Absolute masterpiece of an album. Incredible. So we get to the millennium. We get into the 2000s, and jazz fusion, all of these are under threat because the music industry has died. Downloading's coming, streaming is coming in. People aren't making money off records anymore. The internet hasn't kicked in, so we haven't got the resurgence which is keeping jazz and jazz fusion alive, which is YouTube and all that type of stuff. None of this is happening, and it's dying. And also, when we get to 2000, a lot of the great musicians, jazz musicians, are dying. In the 90s, they were still around. I could go off and see a gig in my local town of people who'd played alongside Charlie Parker very easily and go up to and have a chat. They're all dead. By the 2000s, they're all dead. It's the actual history of jazz by 2000 is moving into history. It's moving into myth. Louis Armstrong was born in 1901. In 2001, he would have been 100 years old, So you have to look around there's a new way that people play jazz. And I'm not on about fusion, but it's a way of playing jazz which encompasses modern studio techniques. It's got aspects of fusion in it. It's got aspects of hip hop, electronica, and all that bit. And this has been embodied by modern jazz groups, for example, like Snarky Puppy, like Bad Bad Not Good, and before then Dirty Loops, but even groups like The Bad Plus, Medeski, Martin and Wood. There's a whole bunch of bands. Now, I remember this starting with the band I've got that's going to represent the 2000s, which is the Esborn Sevenson Trio. So I hope I said that. So I'm going to call them EST from now on. The album that I picked up in the 2000s was called 7 Days of Falling. This group is basically a sort of classic piano trio, really drawing on the sort of ECM European tradition. So it's got this quite cold Icelandic approach. The rhythm section operated a little bit like the Christensen rhythm sections of ECM. But within that, there's a coolness to this. There's a nod towards minimalism, but there's also a nod towards electronica and hip hop. It's light, it's open. It was groundbreaking at the time. When I first heard it, I found it a little bit underwhelming because it operated in an area, the fire wasn't there. This is something that is really apparent in jazz because it was cooler and calmer. It was contemplative. And this band, EST, really had a huge amount of success because they were crossing over. They would do very subtle things like they might put, say, a bit of effects and distortion just on the bass drum of this sort of very bebop-y type drum kit, which would give it an edge. They'd use sort of very looping sounds, but it was also very organic. I think it was a truly great band that I didn't quite get in the 2000s. Now, Esbjørn Svensson, if that's I've pronounced his name right, absolute visionary genius of the 2000s. And then I can't remember whenabouts, but he died in a swimming accident. He went he was into scuba diving, and I think he went down with his son, and his son got stuck, and he saved his son, and then he died, if I've got that right. Same thing that happened to Randy California from Spirit, actually. And so he's no longer there. Nobody talks about EST, but they pioneered everything that then turns into bands like the Bad Plus, that then turns into Medeski and Marty and Wood, and then Medeski and Martin Wood team up with the Wu-Tang Clan. And then the internet kicks in. And at that point, this idea of a jazz group being more like a rock group brings forth the big jazz groups of today. Now, whether pure jazz has survived through this, I don't think it has. It's much more fusion that has survived through this, which is a shame. But I think if the jazz world went back to those EST recordings and had a listen to it, that is the direction that acoustic pure jazz should be taking, right? So we're now into the decade before last. I get accused all the time of not really listening to modern jazz. Now, I do listen to modern jazz. When I come out saying it all sounds the same, I'm really poking my critical finger in the sort of jazz colleges and the way that the language of jazz has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. It's a very subtle thing. And I do it in the belief that A, I want jazz to survive, and B, I want people to get involved in jazz without being put off by the impenetrable elitist bullshit that covers this up as where you've got to be able to do this and got to be able to do that, right? But within the modern jazz world, of course, there are incredible musicians and they're doing incredible things. The reason I don't talk about those is actually because when I come on this channel and talk, I talk about bands that I've been listening to for 30, 40 years. And with a lot of the modern musicians, and this is one of my failings, I had that EST album when it came out. I was in there listening to it going, well, I'm not too sure about this. It's taken me years to turn around and go, yeah, that was a work of genius. That's the sort of person I am, right? So I'm still going to go back 10 years. But for me, when this album came out in 2015, it was so groundbreaking. And when I heard it, even though it's so out there and groundbreaking, I knew I was listening to a work of absolute genius. So I would say the greatest jazz album of the last 15 years is In the Moment by Makaya McCraven. Now, this is a very competent jazz group. Got electric guitar in, but the rest is acoustic jazz. They're working across the whole gamut of languages: bebop, hard bop, modal jazz, jazz fusion, funk, free jazz. It's got all of that in there, which is great. I feel the soloists aren't slavishly playing their, Berklee College licks, although there's a little bit of that in there. And I do miss on here a soloist at the same level as, say, a Sonny Rollins or a Hiromi that we have today. But this soloing is very interesting, especially the guitar playing. I love the guitar playing on this. But Makaya McCraven, who I believe is a drummer, the way this album's created, for me, I believe is the future of jazz. And it influenced me greatly when I heard it. They basically spent, I think, a year just improvising in this bar and recording it, and not recording it well, just capturing everything. And I think after a year or a couple of years of doing this, they ended up with 48 hours worth of improvisations. And then using the techniques of the digital audio workstation and using sort of hip hop techniques, which go back to Bitch's Brew, creating loops, overdubbing in, but sometimes just leaving the thing to go. They create an album which at once sounds like full-on proper jazz, but also seems to occupy the space of contemporary music. It's fascinating. My next project, I think, that I'd really like to do is to try and start working on iPhones. I'd like to improvise, record it on the iPhones, and then use the digital audio workstation to stitch together, in some cases, performances that have been done all at the same time, but also overdubbing and use sort of the sampling and hip-hop techniques. And I think this is the future for jazz, because jazz is such... Anybody who is a jazz fan and has got friends who are not jazz fans and they hate it, and you put it on and suddenly they hear it, they go, oh God, it sounds like they're just playing their own tune and all that type of thing. Until you take them to the jazz club, and then they get in the jazz club and they realise what's going on. They're swept up by everybody else and they're swept up in the moment. I think jazz, for me, I want to see it as much as hear it. I want to see what's going on with the musicians. Sometimes once I've bought into a jazz musician, I can close my eyes and be taken away into the sort of incredible vistas of the imagination. But also I like to watch it. I like to see the musicians interact. I like to see what's going on. That's the future of jazz. And where jazz has been a success is where people have been able to utilise that, using YouTube or Instagram. That's all the modern jazz I see. That's where I see it. It's very rare that I will follow that through to an album. With Makaya McCraven, it was the case. And so that's what I've got at number 10. So there I have what I would say, if you look at it decade by decade and marching our way through, as the 10 greatest jazz albums of, the last 100 years. What does that sound like to you? If you if you were to give someone those 10 albums, what would you be missing? Well, you'd be missing swing. There's no Duke Ellington. There's no Count Basie. So you're missing that great big lump. You're missing some... Well, you got European jazz with Belonging, I suppose, and 7 Days of Falling. What else are you missing? Mingus on covers a lot of the stuff, but maybe cool jazz is not represented. But on the whole, I think that pretty much does okay. And that's the best we can do. So if you like this video, please put a like on it. And if you want to see some more, please subscribe. If you want to support me, I have a Patreon. The link is down below there. You can become a free member or a paid member. And if you want to give me a little tip, as in a financial tip, then, because I've got to show you, I've just drunk my bottle of Fanta and I've got to buy another one today. So if you want to buy me another bottle of Fanta, I have a PayPal tip jar down below, not down there, but down there in the digital world. And if you could do that, that's great. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next video.